people often wonder about, is the DMD of my silage high enough? Or, if I drop down to a poorer quality silage, what effect will that have? I think the biggest effect on milk yield is where there's gaps in dry matter intake, where the cow doesn't have the grass to graze and there's no attempt made to give something else in lieu of that. If you're missing a couple of units of DMD, it's not the ideal, but if you're missing a couple of kilos of dry matter in the diet, you'll get serious falls off in milk output.
With soil moisture deficits increasing across the country, growth is slowing or indeed is at a standstill in some areas. This requires substantial supplementary feeding, and to discuss this I'm joined by Colman Purcell, Nutritionist with Dairygold, to give us his insights on what people should be doing now to ensure cows and indeed other stock on the farm are adequately fed during this period. I started by asking Colman to give an insight into how the weather has been affecting the Dairygold catchment thus far.
I would say, Stuart, that I suppose from a Dairygold point of view, they're probably affected the most. But I would also say, to be fair to the people in those areas, they've probably maintained their milk output the best, even probably better than some of the people in areas where the ground is heavier and maybe not under the same drought stress. And I honestly believe, and I know the people in Dairygold believe, that the people in this area are just so used to droughts at this stage, and anytime we've had a drought, they've probably had the worst of it. And I think they've just become very, very good at managing just managing their cows and managing the nutrition of their cows when they don't have grass. And I think it's expensive, but they're doing a very good job, to be fair to them, at keeping milk output. I think if we want to learn probably how to manage cows in times of drought, these are the people that we should go to and look at, I think.
Yeah, to be fair, that's a very valid comment, Colman, because talking to the lads that work here in the office locally with me, like, they would say that there wasn't too many calls. Lads just seem to be nearly know what to do in a lot of cases. Now, the one comment I did get from a couple of more established lads maybe was that young lads that are now coming home and starting to farm at home hadn't experienced 2018 and were a little bit panicky in some cases because, as you said, it's not cheap now and milk prices low this year, relatively speaking. So people are a little bit maybe concerned, and especially young lads maybe that are starting out. Obviously, finances mightn't be in the best situation anyway, so further pressure doesn't help that situation. So I suppose, like as you said, we are getting used to it. We've probably, since 2018, we've had something nearly every year across the catchment down south anyway, for definite. But just what's the advice to people that aren't used to dealing with this? Now, you mentioned the milk output there. So we'll say from your perspective, what are the indicators that you look at when somebody rings you with a question to know, are they doing the right thing, or have they left it late in terms of direction for how they're performing currently?
Yeah, I think the big thing, Stuart, look, they're the easy things to measure. It's milk output and the drop from week to week in milk output. We would always say 2.5% per week. Watch that kind of a fall. Anything up to that, perfectly normal. Anything more than that, you'd want to be asking questions. And also your milk protein, would want to be increasing week on week or month on month, maybe more obviously. And I think once you see a drop in milk solids or a drop in milk yield, alarm bells then need to be ringing. One of the things we noticed in 2018, and we don't do trials in Dairygold, we have farm observations, but no doubt in 2018, the milk yield at the back end of the year was exceptional, and we always put that down to how well cows were actually fed in the middle of that year, and they weren't fed very cheaply, but they were very well fed. And I suppose the converse of that is that I'd be slightly worried about individual farms where milk yield has dropped, and where nothing was done about it. I'd be worried about, obviously, the immediate effect of that, but I'd be worried about the knock-on effect of it as well, maybe at the back end. And everybody likes to have milk at the back end. I always feel that's very profitable milk to produce, because your fixed costs have probably been covered at that stage. And I would say, as a priority, watch those. If something happens there, it means you've got to react, and you've got to react quickly. And we'd always say as well, the really important thing is, people often wonder about is the DMD of my silage high enough, or if I drop down to a poorer quality silage, what effect will that have? I think the biggest effect on milk yield is where there's gaps in dry matter intake, where the cow doesn't have the grass to graze, and there's no attempt made to give something else in lieu of that. If you're missing a couple of units of DMD, it's not the ideal. But if you're missing a couple of kilos of dry matter in the diet, you'll get serious falls off in that milk output, and that's one thing that we would really focus on, and as a something like to tackle. If you maintain your milk yield, and first and foremost make sure that the cow has enough to eat, and after that then worry about what it is she is eating.
No, that's a valid point, I suppose, and I suppose we did get a bounce in the grass as well from in 2018, which so they were well fed for well out into the back end of the year. So
Yeah.
I suppose that probably emphasises the point of trying to manage the grass even now as well, Colman, because we're in actually a very tricky stage now, just at the time of the year that we're in, where on the higher stock farms we're actually going to be, we should be starting to talk to them about building cover for the autumn. Like the lower stock farms, the cow to the acre type farm, wouldn't have to worry about it for another month or so anyway. But it is important that people realise two things here. They need to fill that gap now, as you said, and they may need to continue to fill that gap for anything up to a month, depending on the stocking rate that they have. And that's all dependent on us getting rain over the next couple of days. We mightn't get that much rain either. We need quite a good bit of rain to actually tip the balance back the other way as well. Like the situation currently, so grass is fading away fairly quickly. We've actually, up to this week, we've probably been in a good enough place, like you said there. So what are you seeing now? And is there a lift in demand? Logistics becoming a challenge from your perspective? What needs to go out? I suppose we might start with that. I suppose what do people need to start doing? So, and there's two scenarios out there as well. I think you mentioned the lads that are in the drought scenario on a regular enough basis and are kind of used to it, and maybe buying a bit of stuff from time to time just to make sure that they have that buffer when they need it, etc. But there's probably two cohorts of people out there at the minute. There's the people who have and the people who don't have. So there's people that have a lot of silage made from the start of the year, and that are happy enough to feed that back now because they know that they still have enough, even with maybe slightly lighter second cuts in the last couple of weeks as well, that they have enough for the winter, and kind of maybe banking a little bit on a good back end now as well when we come out of a dry spell potentially. And then there's the people who are worried about winter feed stocks as well now and don't want to feed that. So I suppose we'll start with group one, the haves. So people have silage in the yard. What should they be doing now from your perspective?
I suppose, Stuart, the first thing that we always say to people is, as well as just watch the labour issues on the farm. If you need a bit, but you have some forage, be it for silage or whatever, for a lot of people, the cheapest option is not to feed extra in the parlour, but it's certainly the easiest option, and that's what we would say to people. It's certainly the easiest option, and we have a surprising number of people that go to pretty high levels in the parlour. Some of those people, bear in mind, mightn't have enough of headspace to go feeding midday feeds as well, and that's a big consideration. And if you don't have the headspace, and you want to supplement outside of the parlour, you're going to be in trouble. So I think the parlour is somewhere that a lot of people should focus on as a starting point. And I think that as the situation gets worse and forage availability goes down, um, I think supplementing outside of the parlour then becomes important at that stage. And we would have people back in 2018. We had people that fed 6 kilos in the parlour and a further 6 as a midday feed. Now that's a lot of concentrate, and you'd be worried about acidosis and rumen health and all of that. Um, but people did very well. Cows were very well fed, and then they gave them silage ad lib um, at that stage, and that worked extremely well for a lot of herds once drought got at its worst and grass availability got at its least. I do have a couple of customers this year that were worried. They would not feed bales that they had in the yard to cows because they wanted them, and they were telling me how long it was until next April. And I accept that as well. Some of those people, to be fair, were able to buy forage. One of them bought hay, and I think we're probably in a good space this year versus 2018. That we started the drought with a lot of forage. And there was actually, maybe people forget it, but we could hardly control the growth up to the point of having the drought, and then we went to the opposite. So at least we're starting this, to be positive about it, with a lot of forage in the country. So whether you have it on farm or not is one thing, but if you don't, it's available elsewhere. Now, no doubt, as this thing goes on, that'll become depleted. Um, ju- just in terms of ordering supplement, in terms of the logistics of it, like I'm not sure if Dairygold is the same as everywhere else. We're busy and we're getting busier. I'm sure everywhere else is the same. For bulk blown loads, in Arctics, we're still managing a next day delivery, provided the order is in early in the morning. Um, we hope to continue that. If things get busier, that might extend out by a day. But at the moment, we're managing next day delivery. We're also managing that for delivery of straight from the port on Arctic lorries. But the one area to be watchful of is where people might need a rigid lorry. There's less of those around, and hauliers in that regard are awfully busy. You probably need a few days' notice for a rigid, and that's something that people should be aware of.
Yeah, and then Colman, you were making the point then as well about and it's a very very valid one. Like, you do your damnedest to try and meet people's needs, but obviously people have to work with you as well. And it's a very valid point to make. Compared to the spring, you know that there's 100 cows going through the parlour that need to be fed 6 kilos. So if you got 10 ton, it's basically 600 kilos into 10 ton. I have
Right.
12, 13 days or whatever it is. I
Yeah.
haven't worked it out there, but so
Yeah.
you need to be ringing your rep then to say, look, I think I'm going to need another load on Wednesday or Thursday next week. And at
Yeah.
least the lads can be putting it into the system, and you can be organising yourselves, because obviously, as you said, their hauliers are going to be being pulled left, right and centre. I suppose everybody will be looking for the freelance hauliers, we'll call them as well now, maybe. So they could come under pressure too. So like, I think that's a very valid point, that people, there's no real excuse for people to be ringing at the last minute looking for an order now.
As the drought progresses, and even if we get rain, we're not going to have grass next day, as you know. Like, as the drought progresses, the level of supplement in the diet, in whatever shape or form, is going to be pretty high. Um, you don't want to be running out of that. That's a huge upset to a cow. It's different if she's on 3 kilos of concentrate, the bin runs empty and you're a day without it. If you're on 10 or 12 kilos of supplement, you certainly don't want to be out of it. So I think helping your feed miller by giving them plenty notice really is just helping yourself. And I think everybody needs to work together in situations like this.
Yeah, so effectively, then Coleman will say the haves and the have-not scenario. The only difference there is actually making the decision as to what you want to use there, really, is it? So it's assessing how much grass is available on the farm, and that is very variable from farm to farm. There are some people that still have grass, but the situation is that depending on the amount of grass that's available, that's going to dictate how much you have to fill back in. And then, like you said, depending on labour availability, etc., how far can you actually go then in the parlour, I suppose, is one question, before you go to the silage element of it then, or the alternative forage, we'll say.
All customers are different. They're all individual. I have customers feeding 8 to 9 kilos in the parlour because they can't feed outside of the parlour. Some of these have high producing cows. Certainly at 9 kilos, you're kind of lying on the offside line there. You certainly don't want to be higher than that. Um, but people are doing that. They're doing it successfully. I'd often question how much value you get from that 9th kilo of concentrate in a situation like that, but they are going up to 9, and if it's causing ill effects in the cows, it's certainly not obvious when you look at the cows. Now, these are people that don't have the facility or maybe the labour, for midday feeds. If you have the facility for a midday supplement, my preference would be probably to go 6 kilos in the parlour and then feed your supplement outside of the parlour. Um, I think anything that spreads the load is worth a lot. And we often talk about the UFL value of ingredients, but I think one of the things that we often ignore is that if you take a high UFL feed and feed a huge quantity of it in the parlour, are you actually getting that level of UFL out of the concentrate? Because you're putting it into a room, and that that now is not as healthy as you'd like it to be. There's a lot of acid in there. Um, I can remember years ago, a customer I had, and this is a number of years ago. He fed 10 kilos in the parlour. He did nothing else, and he split the same 10 into three feeds. He still fed 10 kilos. And it's so long ago, I don't remember the response, but it was a couple of litres of milk. And he didn't feed any more concentrate. So clearly, he was getting a greater level of net energy from that diet just by feeding it a different way. And that's just one thing that I would say to people. You can safely go to 8. You can push it up to 9, maybe even 10, but I question the value of the last kilo or two at those extremely high levels. And if you have a facility, if you have the labor, and if you have the headspace, splitting that and having a midday supplement, I think is definitely a much better way to go.
As grass declines on farms, is there a need to change the protein levels in the supplement that has been purchased?
At the moment, in terms of what's actually happening, is that we're varying from about 14 to 18% crude protein in the supplement. As you're aware, the maximum crude protein level allowable doesn't apply once you bring forages into a diet. And it surprises me how poorly known that is actually out there. I think it's important people are aware of that. If grass isn't the full diet, the maximum doesn't apply, and I think you have to give the cow what the cow actually needs. So does the cow need a higher level of crude protein? I think once you bring in a lot of supplements fed as midday supplements tend to be not overly high in protein. Although the people that feed pan kernel, there is a decent level of protein in that particular ingredient, all right. Some of our customers are now going to an 18% parlour cube. A lot of them are doing it as a probably just in case, because in 2018 they saw how protein levels in the grass dropped, particularly once the drought really got hold. When we look at our milk urea nitrogen levels, and they tend to correlate, as far from what I can see, pretty well with the crude protein level in the diet. In terms of averages across the entire society, we are not seeing problems yet. Our milk urea nitrogens are still up around the 20-21 mark. There's certainly no issue once you're up at that level. But I would expect, if the drought continues, I would expect those to fall. I would say to people, watch those. And if you're unsure, and if you're feeding a lot of silage and maybe a low protein supplement, an 18% in the parlour, I think would be a safer option in a situation like that.
Yeah, and obviously that's not that's generic advice as such. So, like individual
Absolutely.
cases, they'll have to be careful of what they're doing there.
In Dairygold, as I said, our issue is never using the volume of grain that comes into us. It's how we use it. I mean, we went out this year and bought oats. I mean, people tell me that no mill wants oats. We value them very highly. We went out and bought them because we ran out of our oats, and if I recall correctly, I think we did the same last year. So I suppose we all think differently. But I just think that native grains, like, definitely have a place to play in a high quality parlour cube. They're vital in that, I would say. And I think they can have a part to play then as well in a supplement outside. Obviously, you don't want to overload starch. And one of the things that they do as well, and people should remember this, is that if you do like a high fibre supplement outside of the parlour, like for example soya hulls, they can stretch it, because there's a huge demand on these ingredients at the moment. And as I say, if we get rain next weekend, we probably won't have this conversation anymore. But if we don't, we might be
Could be a running weekly call with you.
correct. Yeah. So I mean, look, I think that's important.
So, Colman, what's the situation with other stocks such as dairy replacements and maybe the dairy beef calves?
Certainly, I would be looking at growth rates of about 0.7 of a kilo per day for these type of stock. And I always feel that it's difficult to recover lost growth earlier in the year. That a nice even growth is important for these. I know there was some work done in UCD with dairy replacement calves, and they found actually milk yield responses, if I remember correctly, to growth rates up to about 0.8 per kilo per day. So, calves that performed well up to the point of view of breeding and calving down actually add milk yield advantages in doing it. So I would say that we shouldn't forget the calves. I suppose in my job, I deal a lot with dairy cows, but any calf is as important as a dairy cow. It's going to be the dairy cow there in a year and a half's time. So I think maintaining growth rate in all of those animals is vitally, vitally important. We have an advantage with dairy cows because we have easily measured um, uh, things like, say, milk yield, milk protein levels. It's less obvious with these animals. You've got to physically go out and do the weight gain, so it's a bit more challenging in that regard. But definitely, I would think that moving in with some supplement for these animals is really important in times of drought. And the other comment I would make is that these animals, as important as they are, and as genetically superior, as genetically good as they are, you know, physically they're small. They don't have big intakes, and keeping those animals right actually costs very little. In terms of cost of supplement to keep your weight gains up. So I think that's really, really important. But the big thing is to be able to spot deficits and get in time just to maintain your growth rates.
So what should people feed in that situation then, Colman?
I would always say to people, if there's a fear of drought, in terms of cost, most mills will probably have maybe a 14% high energy cube and maybe a 16% high energy cube. These are protein levels as fed basis. The difference in cost in moving protein up 2 percentage units is extremely small. So I would say keep the energy as high as you can. I would say for safety's sake, because again, people aren't going out measuring protein level on commercial farms. They're not measuring protein levels in grass where the calves are grazing. If the grass is drought stressed, I think for safety's sake, it's better to go in with a 16% crude protein cube for those calves. And I think keep the energy level as high as you possibly can.
Where farms have cattle that will be finished this year, what should they be doing in relation to those animals at the moment, you think?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to keep cattle moving at a certain level up to the point where you're going to start the finishing period. I think that's really important. And if there are cattle on a farm that are forward enough in weight to be able to start the finishing period and finish in the 3 months or whatever period of time, I think it would be a good idea to move those in and to get that cohort of cattle started on the finishing period. Obviously, availability of housing and all that is important there. But the other thing is it takes those cattle off the ground and reduces your stocking rate as well. In terms of the animals that are left outside, I would think that some level of supplement just to keep them ticking over rather than having them at a standstill, I think would be a necessary requirement there.
Like Colman, I would imagine that in most cases people can get away with supplementing the beef stock outside. They don't necessarily the younger stock. They don't have to go housing younger stock.
No, I mean, I think, look, with younger stock, I mean, 2.5 kilos of concentrate is regularly fed on farms outside. The only one thing I would say is that you would want to be splitting that into 2 feeds ideally. So it's an extra job, but for a young animal, that's a pretty high, for an animal's first year at grass, it's a pretty high proportion of their diet in the form of concentrate. So I think it's really important just to split that into 2 feeds.
And that's something I would say regularly, in fairness, is that like feeding those R1s as we call them, like there's great return for that investment there to make sure that they're performing relative to trying to correct it the following year, when at this time of the year on, when you realise that breeding heifers aren't up to the weights that they should be, and trying to push them on the 2 kilos that you would have given in the first year go a very long way in year one compared to what they don't go. They really don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, so I suppose we'll wrap it up with that. Hopefully, Colman, we won't have to call on you again in the next couple of weeks, and fingers crossed that we'll get a bit of rain over the next few days and reverse the dial basically. And
very good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Colman Purcell for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.